This week, we're going to talk about the MeToo movement as an example of some social issues campaigns. So, the MeToo movement, if you are not familiar, I'll get into a little background, but essentially, it's a really good example of how individuals can come together and communicate something specific and seek solutions. Now, there are some well-placed criticisms and concerns about this type of process, but we'll get into those in just a moment. So if you're not familiar, the Me Too movement was a hashtag started by someone that basically said, if all women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote Me Too as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. And it really took off when Alyssa Milano, the actor, posted this and said, if you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write Me Too as a reply to this tweet. And so the hashtag Me Too took off, and people started sharing their own stories. And there was an effort to communicate this all around the world. And once this conversation began, it led to why aren't things being done? What kind of policy solutions can be done? How do we identify the perpetrators of sexual harassment and assault? And what kinds of changes can we make? And so what did the movement kind of look like? Well, it took its own form in lots of different places. You can see Yo también in Spanish. Not great at Italian, so I'll che la volte c'è in Italian. And then in France, there was actually a kind of Me Too movement that existed before, but again took off afterwards. So this became a global conversation in multiple languages. And it also spurred other conversations, such as it was me, I have, and how will I change? And so this was mostly men who came out and talked about times that they were the perpetrators of these acts and, said that they're going to do something different. And so you had people on both sides of the issue who were discussing this. So the hashtag trended in 85 different countries, and in the first 24 hours of Milano's tweet, 500,000 people responded. So this, when we talk about things going viral, that's going viral, right? So this got a lot of attention. So a lot of times we talk about in campaigns how to get people to notice what we're saying. This was not an issue here. So the question often, that's leveled at the Me Too movement is, what did it do? Okay, people shared their stories, and some of them are, incredibly heartbreaking and frustrating that they have occurred, and the accountability hasn't been there. And what can we do, right? And those conversations certainly arise. But what kinds of concrete things can we point to that have happened? Well, we're going to look at some data here from the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. And what they did is they looked at the number of searches that occurred on Google specifically from a baseline, so pre-Me Too. And they looked at 6 months and they looked at 3 months change from November 29th, 2017. And so what did we see? And so what is the percent of change that we saw from the baseline? And so if you follow the Me Too line, so obviously the change from the baseline, right, after 3 months, there was a 7,000% increase in Me Too. And even 6 months later, from that baseline, it was still up considerably. And then you look at things like sexual assault, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, and rape as search terms. Most of them, the searches went up, right? What are these things? How do we define them? What are instances of this happening? What are the stories people are telling? What kinds of, consequences are there? And what kinds of changes are happening? And so even after 6 months, all three of those terms were prevalent and highly searched. So when we talk about, did the Me Too movement do anything? Did it change the national conversation besides, oh, this is something that people could post and here's this thing, isn't that nice, people are sharing and move on? Well, in the everyday activity, you can see that there was a significant increase in the amount of internet activity and searching and learning about these terms following the Me Too movement coming out. So one of the end results, some of these social movements, yes, we want to see real changes. We want to see policy changes, but sometimes we want to change how people think and feel and that they are seeking information about these topics. This is the case where the data support that did in fact occur. There was a marked increase in the amount of search activities about these ideas, and the content that for the most part exists fit the narrative that the MeToo movement is hoping would be out there. So you saw a significant change in how people talked about these things. So we're going to talk about some of the pieces that went into this and some of the kind of the campaign concepts that make this work. So one is the use of hashtag activism. Now, we've spoken a little bit about this, but it never hurts to reiterate some things. So what do hashtags do for us, particularly when we think about them with activism and campaigns? Well, hashtags are a tool to activate certain interpretive frames or certain open the door to certain conversations. So hashtags are an easy way to link together different posts that are in the same conversation. So in the vast social media landscape, there are millions of posts every day, and how do you find the content that you want? Well, the hashtag is an easy way to tie them together. And so there are lots of instances of this, right? The resist, Me Too, Never Again, Black Lives Matter, Love Wins, right? There's lots of instances of this. And they are all user-generated content that are connecting the audience. So the beauty in hashtag activism is you have individuals who are speaking about their own understanding and their experiences about this topic in a way that obviously relates to your target audience because they're the ones saying it. So a lot of times with a campaign, we're trying to figure out, how do I phrase this in a way that my audience is going to understand, or how do I make this resonate with my target audience? Well, the best way to do that is to have your target audience generate the content, right? And so this is a really good example of a grassroots movement, exactly what we were talking about not that long ago, that if you have people from the bottom up generating the content, then you can almost guarantee that that content is going to resonate. Now, what you face with hashtag activism is it raises the risk for backlash because you're no longer in control over the message and the campaign itself. There is now a key to the chat that is happening about this topic, and everyone has a copy of that key, and anyone can enter the conversation and say whatever they like. So it's the same as though if you went to a protest and someone showed up to counter-protest. Someone shows up the megaphone and tries to shout down your group. That's exactly what happens with hashtag activism. Someone who disagrees, who will come on and just start, raising a ruckus. And so the conversation can get distracted from what the aims are of the particular campaign or the movement, and instead focus on the details of what one person is shouting. So you may have individuals who are vocal, well-known, who are amplifying the message like Alyssa Milano did in this case. But you can also have someone on the other side who just makes enough noise that the conversation is no longer how do we socially, culturally deal with this topic, and instead how do we deal with that guy over there, right? And that's not particularly useful for the outcome of the campaign. So what are ways that this can create some problems for a campaign, right? And so why might we choose something like a socially mediated campaign and hashtag activism? And why are things like, the Me Too movement sort of anomalous? Well, one of the things is this spiral of silence theory, which basically says that you have what is the popular opinion, and minority opinions end up being silenced. So as a conversation continues to circulate and the dominant conversation all takes one position, if you disagree, you are less likely to speak up because you don't want to be shouted down by the majority, right? The minorities and the minority opinion tends to speak less because it's disheartening, it's saddening, it's depressing, and it feels futile to try to argue with someone, and the majority of people are shouting you down. So you have a person with an unpopular opinion, they tend to remain silent. So this is exactly what was happening with the MeToo movement, right? That there were people who felt like the dominant conversation was that they were alone, they were isolated, but if everyone spoke up, that changes the dominant voice, right? That these things are happening to a lot of people, a lot of women experience this, and so the conversation was shifted, and so instead of remaining silent, everyone had the opportunity to speak. Now, how much does this, spiral of silence really affect people, right? Are there stories of people speaking up? Sure, absolutely. But another way we can see this playing out is that in countries that had stronger civil liberty protections, more women spoke out than in countries with weaker civil liberty protections. So Western countries, democratic governments, where people had a stronger sense of free speech were more likely to speak out and to post this content. So if the dominant conversation was so dominating, people didn't feel safe to speak an alternative message. And so that's exactly what the Me Too movement was kind of about, right? Is that we need to know that this is happening and you are not alone and everyone has the opportunity to speak. Now, another way to approach this is the idea of muted group theory, which is basically not quite that people who are in the minority end up feeling silenced, right? Like Spiral of Silence would say. But instead, the dominant group tends to shape and control the language around a topic. So they can do this through the terminology, right? What we name things. It could be through the images we use to represent certain groups. It could be the media we produce and consume. And so when there is disagreement with that narrative, it is actively tamped down. It is repressed and it's muted, right? They're told to be silent and be quiet. And, why would you disagree with what everyone is saying, right? And so while the spiral of silence is more on how the minority voice will feel, right? I don't feel like I can participate because that's not the conversation that's happening socially and culturally. Muted group theory is more about what happens with the dominant group and how they will actively seek to maintain their dominance over those minority voices. So a good example of this, if you were to look at third-party candidates, they are not taken seriously. They are mocked. They are told, why are you messing up the system? Your presence in an election is just going to harm X party because you're stealing votes, and voting for you is essentially voting for the other right there. They're told that your presence is not welcomed and you create a problem. Another instance where you see this is this idea of the social model of disability, which basically says that when someone sees a physical disability, we assume there are other disabilities as well. So if someone is blind, we assume, well, then they can't be very intelligent. Or if someone uses a wheelchair, well, they can't be very smart. And we see this played out in the media that we consume. When someone has a physical disability, they're usually mean. They are often the villains. They are never the hero. They are never a protagonist. They are never someone who is likable in a show. And so people get this sense of consuming media that if you are physically different, then you must be emotionally and psychologically different and therefore unlikable. And so when we represent media and people in certain groups in that way, you get that same response, right? And so if someone tries to say, well, I feel like I need, we should have accommodations so everyone can be at the table, right? And that means making it accessible. Well, why would we have you at the table when you don't have anything to contribute, is the narrative that media tends to spin about people who may have a physical disability, right? And that is true for men and women as well, right? The dominant group in this country is men, And why would we bring a woman to the table? Why would we have a female president, right? The conversation is, well, they're, right, the typical responses, well, they're emotional or whatever, right? That they will be told, we don't want you at the table because of something that is about you, and we shape that narrative, so then you don't get to be at the table. So if we are trying to fight against that with a campaign, it can be really difficult because the way we even enter the conversation is at a disadvantage. The last example or the last theory I should say to talk about is social identity theory. And essentially this is in-group versus out-group, right? You are part of this group, you're part of that group. And the out-group is the different, less preferred instance. And a really good example of this played out in recent years is the vaccine, right? The pro-vax and the anti-vax groups. And so you saw a lot of this happening from departments of public health, in which you saw images like this, right? Of people who got the vaccine, yay, thumbs up, check mark with the Band-Aid, right? And the people who didn't, right? You show these like nefarious multicolored viruses in the background and like, oh no, now I have a temperature and I feel sick, right? And so these happen quite a bit, particularly in the health context, right? If you're in the in group, you're going to be healthy. If you're in the out group, then, well, negative things are going to happen to you, and that's unfortunate. We want you to join the in group. Now, how does this relate to things like the MeToo movement? Well, if you think about this from a social identity theory perspective, that you have the in-group versus out-group and how people were included versus excluded, you had something called passive empathy happening, in which people who were in the in-group would say, yeah, that's really terrible that happened. And then that's kind of the end of it. And the other response is that it can really, really make a hard line between the in-group and out-group. So that group distinction becomes stronger and more difficult to overcome, such that conversations between the two groups are more and more unlikely and less productive. So if we are so far apart in our beliefs about the world, my campaign is never going to reach you. So one of the consequences that people point to of the Me Too movement is that those that were never going to be supportive of women speaking up are just going to be emboldened to try to shout this down. And so part of the in-group and out-group identity is that if your group is right, my group has to be wrong. And if I'm caught up in belonging to my group, then I'm going to protect it. And the way I'm going to do that is to attack you. So the end result of a social movement, you know that it's working when people are mad at you and telling you to be quiet, right? That's when you know that you have struck a chord with people in the out group from your perspective, and you are trying to reach them. So I'm going to finish with including an example video for you to look at. And it is an instance where a group tried to tackle some of these topics prior to the Me Too movement about representation in the media. And what I want you to pay attention to is, yes, some of the instances, right, are going to be kind of shocking and surprising, and they're really going to show muted group theory and this idea of spiral of silence, and all of these concepts kind of played out in another instance. But the end result that is often a criticism of the Me Too movement, and you'll see here, is what's the action? Like, what do you want me to do? What is the consequence of doing this campaign? Like, I thought about it, or gosh, passive empathy, right? That's a really sad story, and I'm sorry that happened. Anyway, moving on, right? But that's not what you want. So what is the end result? And I think this video is a really good example. It's really powerful up until the end of what do you want me to do? And so a lot of these movements lack that clear vision of what the world looks like and how do we get there. So what is the action statement? So when you watch the video, I want you to pay attention to that, and you can see some of these things that we were talking about just now playing out really clearly.
love giving blowjobs to sandwiches.
I love sacrificing my dignity for a drink.
I love sleeping with guys that don't know my name.
The pursuit of happiness, just as our forefathers wanted.
I hope when my daughter grows up that she has friends just like these.
The key to my heart? A man that smells like a vagina.
I'd sell my body for a burger. Nothing makes me hotter than watching a guy get his head blown off.
I'm only here for your entertainment. What goes great with this dish? My butt.
Obviously, my cleavage can sell anything.
When I reach into my designer handbag, you know I'm naked. This shirt looks too good for pants.
Peekaboo. Like what you see?